Before the first strike of lightning, no one imagined a single voice could silence an entire aircraft. As chaos threatened to tear the flight apart, the passenger least expected to lead would decide the fate of every soul on board. Be sure to like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you're watching and which part of the journey stays with you. The night began with an uneasy quiet that masked the danger gathering ahead, as Flight 782, a Boeing 777 carrying 278 passengers, cut across the vast Pacific sky on its long route from Tokyo to Los Angeles. To most aboard, it was just another overnight journey, one filled with restless travelers adjusting pillows, scrolling through their devices, and closing their eyes to chase a few hours of sleep. Yet, hidden within the thrumming engines and dimmed cabin lights, a black man named Marcus Daniels sat in seat 19A, his body trained by years of service to fall asleep under almost any condition. Though tonight, even in slumber, he carried the heaviness of memory. Marcus, at 38, had lived a life where silence and invisibility often accompanied him, especially in rooms where his skin color shaped assumptions before he ever spoke. He wore a plain shirt, simple jeans, and traveled without adornment, not seeking attention, not eager for recognition. Still, he was no ordinary passenger, though to those around him, he seemed only another face in the crowd. Above them, unseen by passengers still engrossed in their quiet routines, storm clouds formed like walls of ink, brewing with violence. Lightning forked across the horizon, illuminating jagged clouds, and thunder rolled with the weight of cannons, warning of an atmosphere more hostile than any manual could describe. Inside the cockpit, Captain Harris's sharp eyes flickered across his instruments, every gauge confirming what he already feared. They were flying into the maw of a storm system capable of shattering even the most seasoned nerves. The Boeing 777 pressed on at 41,000 feet, engines humming with strain as turbulence gripped the fuselage, shaking it like a toy in a child's fist. Then, with cruel suddenness, Captain Harris gasped, clutching his chest. His co-pilot called his name, voice sharp, but the captain's hand slipped from the controls as his body lurched backward, eyes rolling lifelessly. The cockpit filled with the alarming whine of warning signals as the heart monitor beeped erratically. The younger co-pilot, sweat slicking his forehead, realized with horror that he was alone, burdened with responsibility for nearly 300 souls, and unprepared for the fury closing in. His hands trembled, and his breath came shallow as he reached for the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice cracked, echoing in a tone that betrayed desperation. "Captain Harris is incapacitated. If there is anyone aboard with fighter pilot or combat aviation experience, I need your help. Please, I beg you, come forward now." The announcement tore through the cabin like a blade. At first came silence, the kind where hundreds of minds froze in disbelief, processing words that seemed impossible. Then came whispers, rising in pitch, turning to gasps and shouts as the aircraft jolted violently, overhead compartments rattling, and a mother screamed when her child's toy slid down the aisle. Some passengers prayed aloud, their voices trembling over the roar of turbulence. Others pulled out phones, typing frantic messages, convinced these might be their last words sent to loved ones. A teenage boy clutched his rosary beads, eyes squeezed shut. In business class, white lawyer Charles Wentworth adjusted his tailored jacket and scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain as he muttered loud enough for those around him to hear, as if anyone qualified would be sitting back there in economy. His smug tone cut through the chaos, reinforcing the cruel assumption many silently held, that skill, authority, and salvation could not come from someone seated among the ordinary. Meanwhile, the storm lashed at the windows, rain striking in torrents that sounded like fists of stone, the Boeing groaning under pressure as the co-pilot's frantic voice returned, trembling harder this time. "Please, if anyone has combat aviation training, we are in critical danger. I cannot hold her steady much longer." In row 19A, Marcus stirred. The black man shifted upright, opening his eyes to the madness around him. He saw fear etched across strangers' faces, passengers clutching at faith, money, or one another, anything that felt like control. He listened to the panic swirl, the assumption that salvation must wear a certain face, must come dressed in a polished suit, must sit in first class. Marcus remained silent for a breath, his training instructing patience even when urgency screamed. He remembered other storms, though not of weather, but of war, where missiles lit skies and decisions meant the line between saving lives or losing them. His heartbeat remained steady, his breathing calm, the old instincts already returning. Around him, passengers whispered, "Surely, someone up front knows something," while ignoring the quiet man in their midst, a black figure they had dismissed before even considering. The irony pressed heavy against Marcus's chest. They begged for a fighter pilot, and a fighter pilot sat right here, invisible. The turbulence grew savage, the aircraft shuddering with a ferocity that sent oxygen masks swaying threateningly from their compartments. A woman sobbed openly, declaring she would never see her grandchildren again. A businessman cursed, demanding answers no one could give. The air was thick with helplessness, but Marcus's eyes sharpened. His thoughts steadied, replaying checklists and procedures he had drilled 1,000 times. He felt not fear, but a calling, that subtle shift when chaos became clarity. He had been underestimated his entire career, his worth doubted before he proved it, his competence questioned for the color of his skin. Tonight, it would be no different. Only this time, the stakes were not promotions or recognition. Tonight, 278 lives were balanced on the razor's edge of fate. Marcus drew a slow breath, tightened his grip on the armrest, and whispered to himself words he had spoken countless times before a mission. It's time. He straightened fully, no longer hidden in the shadows of indifference. The co-pilot's desperate plea still echoed overhead. "Is there a fighter pilot on board?" Marcus Daniels blinked the sleep from his eyes as the words of the desperate co-pilot still echoed overhead, his body adjusting from the half-rested state he had forced himself into during the long journey from Seoul to Tokyo and now across the Pacific. He had been trained to snatch sleep whenever he could, even amid gunfire or roaring engines, and that habit allowed him to remain calm in moments where others collapsed under stress. Around him, passengers gripped their armrests and looked wildly about, as if salvation might materialize out of thin air. He knew already that most did not expect that salvation to come from him, and in truth they were not even considering him, because a black man in worn jeans and a plain travel shirt was invisible in their eyes, overlooked before he even had a chance to speak. The Boeing shuddered again, and screams rippled through the cabin, flight attendants pushing carts hastily back into galleys while attempting to wear comm masks that fooled no one. Marcus exhaled slowly, his mind assessing, and though his instinct urged him to act, a lifetime of being doubted reminded him that timing mattered, that sometimes revealing yourself too soon only brought mockery rather than obedience. He had seen officers laugh in his face when he introduced himself, had endured skeptics until results proved otherwise. That lesson, painful as it was, had taught him to pick the precise moment to rise. Up in business class, Charles Wentworth was already making himself heard, standing half out of his wide leather seat, one hand gripping a glass of scotch even as the aircraft rocked violently. "Listen to this nonsense," he barked at anyone who would listen, his voice heavy with entitlement. "They expect us to believe that some miracle fighter pilot is on board. Ridiculous. If anyone with skill were truly here, he wouldn't be back there in coach like the rest of these nobodies." Several nearby passengers nodded nervously, comforted by his confidence, not because it was rooted in fact, but because certainty itself was a drug in moments of fear. Charles straightened his tie, as though composure alone made him credible, and went on boasting. "My cousin owns 3 private planes. I've flown in them countless times. I know more about procedures than half these so-called pilots. Trust me, if someone needs to step up, it will be me." His words dripped with arrogance, but some clung to them nonetheless, desperate for leadership even from a man whose authority came only from wealth. Marcus watched the scene, every muscle still, his dark eyes reflecting both the storm outside and the storm within. He remembered when he had been 19, entering flight school for the Air Force, surrounded by classmates who whispered he would never make it, who smirked when instructors overlooked his hand in favor of paler faces. He had learned then that the world did not expect a black man to lead from a cockpit, that competence was questioned before it was witnessed. Tonight was only a repetition of that old truth, except the stakes were hundreds of innocent lives, not just his own dignity. Another violent jolt slammed the plane sideways, luggage tumbling from an overhead bin to the floor. A woman shrieked, clutching her child tighter, and the smell of spilled whiskey mingled with fear in the recycled air. Marcus tightened his jaw. He had lived through sandstorms in Iraq that turned daylight into choking darkness, had flown blind over mountain ranges with radar destroyed, had guided squadrons through missile fire where survival was measured in heartbeats. Compared to those missions, this storm was merely another enemy, though far larger and more indifferent. Yet, to the people around him, he remained unseen. The co-pilot's voice returned, almost cracking into tears now, pleading, "If anyone has fighter pilot training, please come forward. I cannot do this alone." The silence that followed was deafening. Passengers glanced at each other with wide eyes, but no one stood. Charles seized the moment, puffing his chest. "There you have it. The kid is panicking. But don't worry, I've been on flights through turbulence before. I'll talk to him. I'll show him how it's done." He began to move toward the aisle, his expensive watch glinting in the flashing lightning. Marcus felt the injustice bite at him like icy wind. The man who knew nothing but privilege was being treated as a savior, while he, a decorated pilot with hundreds of combat hours, was dismissed because of appearance. He knew this pattern too well. White men with money or connections claimed authority, while black men with proven skill were doubted. His fingers pressed into his knees as he leaned forward slightly, considering the moment. He thought of his father's voice years ago, telling him, "They'll never hand you respect, son. You'll have to seize it and prove it every single time." Charles Wentworth moved with an air of certainty, as if his wealth and his tailored suit gave him authority no storm could strip away, his hand gripping the back of a seat for balance, while the plane lurched violently. His voice raised above the frightened murmurs to proclaim, "I have logged hundreds of hours in private jets. My cousin owns 3, and I know more about procedure than any of you think. This is not my first flight through rough skies. And if anyone here has the right to speak to the cockpit, it is me." His words carried arrogance, but also confidence. And in that moment, confidence alone felt like oxygen to passengers desperate for hope. So several nodded, clinging to his authority even though it came from entitlement rather than experience. A flight attendant hurried toward him, her face strained with fear yet polite, saying, "Sir, please return to your seat. Turbulence is dangerous right now." But Charles brushed her aside with a wave, muttering, "Nonsense, I'm going to help. These children up front need a steady hand." His watch glinted in another flash of lightning. The cabin filled with gasps as the aircraft dropped sharply and then leveled, screams rising as luggage clattered against the floor. Marcus Daniels watched, his jaw tightening, his dark eyes following every movement of a lawyer who postured like a savior. He could feel the judgmental glances around him, passengers overlooking him entirely, some whispering among themselves that perhaps the man in business class was their best hope. Marcus felt the familiar sting of dismissal, the centuries-old narrative that competence could not possibly reside in a black man dressed simply in jeans and a travel shirt, a man who had boarded quietly and carried himself with humility. He thought of the countless times he had been doubted in uniform, when his voice was silenced in briefings until results forced acknowledgement, when colleagues whispered that promotions came not from skill but from quotas, when medals pinned to his chest were still not enough to erase suspicion. The memories surged like ghosts of past battles, yet with them came strength, because he had learned long ago that being underestimated was not a curse but a weapon, fuel to prove wrong every doubter who ever crossed his path. Another violent tremor ripped through the aircraft, oxygen masks swinging, a child sobbing uncontrollably as her mother rocked her, whispering prayers. The co-pilot's voice cracked again over the speaker. "Please, anyone with combat aviation training, identify yourself immediately. I cannot control her much longer." Charles grinned smugly and shouted back, "I'm coming forward. I've got flight knowledge. I've seen procedures dozens of times." Some passengers clapped in nervous relief, eager to believe in him. But Marcus had heard enough. He drew a deep breath, stood slowly, and his movements carried a steadiness that contrasted sharply with the chaos. The storm roared, the plane shook, but Marcus stood balanced, his presence commanding in its quiet power. He stepped into the aisle, his broad shoulders squared, his gaze calm and unflinching. For the first time, murmurs hushed, curious eyes turning toward the man they had overlooked. He spoke with a voice deep and steady, the kind shaped by years of issuing commands that could not be questioned in combat zones. "Excuse me," he said firmly, his tone cutting through the panic without need for volume. "Marcus Daniels, former Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force. 720 hours on F-35 fighters, multiple tours, combat tested, storm navigation qualified. I will go to the cockpit." The cabin fell into stunned silence. Even Charles froze mid-boast, his mouth slightly open as if struck dumb. The flight attendant who had tried to stop Charles took a step back, her eyes wide as she studied Marcus, recognizing something real in his voice that needed no validation. A ripple of disbelief spread among the passengers, some whispering, "Did he just say Lieutenant Colonel?" while others shook their heads, too steeped in prejudice to accept it at face value. Charles found his voice again, muttering with disdain, "You've got to be joking. No one like you ends up with credentials like that." His words hung heavy with implication, the racism unspoken but felt by all. Marcus did not flinch, his gaze fixed on the forward cabin, his stride measured, as if turbulence itself respected his balance. Each step was a statement that though ignored, though dismissed, he would no longer be silent. The passengers, still uncertain, found themselves drawn into his orbit, sensing in him a calm authority that no suit or boast could replicate. He was not trying to impress. He was embodying the difference between hollow words and lived truth. Another violent jolt made Charles stumble, grabbing the seat for balance, while Marcus remained steady, his feet planted like a pilot accustomed to forces far greater than weather. The contrast was undeniable, and even those who doubted could not ignore what their eyes told them. Composure under fire is not faked. Marcus reached the front rows, and the flight attendant beside the cockpit door, trembling but searching for direction, asked, "Are you really military?" Marcus met her gaze, his voice even. "Yes, ma'am, Lieutenant Colonel, Air Force, former callsign Falcon. If you want this plane to land, let me through." The co-pilot's shaky voice crackled again, desperation spilling into every syllable. "Please, we need help now." Marcus nodded, his hand brushing the cockpit door as the attendant opened it, but before entering he turned back to the cabin, his eyes locking briefly with Charles, who was glaring, lips curled in contempt. Marcus's calm words cut the air. "When this is over, perhaps you will understand that strength and skill don't wear a specific skin. They wear discipline." The cockpit door had barely shut behind Marcus when the whispers began to coil through the cabin like smoke, feeding on fear, doubt, and prejudice. He had introduced himself with composure, had declared his rank, his hours, and his training, but for many passengers those words clashed with the image their minds insisted upon, because what they saw was a black man in simple travel clothes, not a decorated officer, not a savior. One woman in first class leaned toward her neighbor and whispered loud enough to be overheard, "He doesn't look like a colonel, not at all. Too young, too ordinary." Her neighbor nodded quickly, clutching a gold necklace, and muttered, "Anyone can say they were in the military. But do you really believe someone with those credentials would be flying economy? Impossible." The sentiment echoed across rows, people shaking their heads, murmuring, convincing themselves that appearance told more truth than words, and that doubt, though ugly, felt safer than faith in the unfamiliar. Charles Wentworth seized the moment like a vulture spotting carrion. His voice rose above the murmurs, mocking, "Did you hear him? Lieutenant Colonel, Air Force, F-35 fighters. Oh yes, that sounds like a fairy tale. What proof does he have? None. He just struts down the aisle and expects us to believe it." He chuckled bitterly, his tone dripping poison into already shaken minds. "I've dealt with imposters before, people who claim medals and titles. But when lives are at stake, talk is cheap. I say he's bluffing." A few nodded in uneasy agreement, their eyes darting between Charles and the cockpit door where Marcus had vanished. Yet not everyone remained convinced by Charles's arrogance. An elderly man shook his head slowly, whispering. There was something in his voice though, something real. A young mother hushed her crying baby and whispered back, "Maybe. But what if he's wrong? What if he makes it worse?" Fear fueled suspicion. Suspicion fueled prejudice, and soon the cabin was a hive of unease, clashing voices rising, some defending Marcus faintly, others condemning him outright, and all of it rooted in the same dangerous undercurrent. They could not reconcile the image of a black man in coach with the authority of a combat pilot. Inside the cockpit, Marcus ignored the storm of opinions swirling beyond the door, because he had learned long ago that doubters were as inevitable as turbulence. He moved with precision, sliding into the captain's chair, his hands finding controls with instinctive familiarity, the young co-pilot staring at him with wide eyes that mixed relief with disbelief. Marcus's voice was calm but commanding, altitude 41,000 feet, speed 480 knots, turbulence index rising, crosswinds 130 kilometers per hour. We need to establish emergency protocol immediately. The co-pilot stammered, "Why, yes, but the manual says." Marcus cut him off with authority, reciting by memory the exact classified emergency sequence. Loss of pressurization at altitude requires immediate oxygen deployment. Emergency descent to 12,000 feet. Descent angle capped at 14 degrees to avoid stress fractures. Code 7700 broadcast on all frequencies. Copy and transmit now. The co-pilot blinked, stunned by the fluency, his fingers moving automatically to follow the commands, the disbelief in his eyes slowly replaced by admiration. Marcus adjusted navigation controls, his voice steady. "We need storm penetration at 32,000 feet, vector 35 degrees east, roll angle no more than 22, throttle fluctuations at 5% intervals, counter turbulence with opposite rudder." He rattled off detail after detail, his tone unwavering, and though the aircraft still bucked under the storm's fury, the cockpit filled with the presence of someone who knew precisely what to do. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, Charles sneered at the crowd around him. Anyone can memorize a script. He probably watched a movie or read something online. Don't be fooled. You want your life in the hands of a fraud. His words struck nerves, but then the intercom crackled. Marcus's voice flowing through the speakers, calm and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are initiating emergency storm penetration procedures. Remain seated with seat belts fastened, oxygen masks ready, and follow all crew instructions. This aircraft will endure, but we need cooperation." His tone was not pleading, not uncertain, but the kind of voice that expected obedience, the kind of voice soldiers followed into battle. A hush swept through the cabin, the passengers frozen by the clarity of authority they had not expected. A flight attendant near Charles whispered almost reverently, "That is no script, that's a pilot." But Charles, unwilling to yield, barked back, "It's a con. You'll see, we'll all regret letting him touch those controls." He was met this time not with nods, but with stares of discomfort, some passengers quietly shifting away from him, the tide of belief beginning to turn. In the cockpit, Marcus continued his work, guiding the co-pilot step by step, his mind operating on a level far beyond manuals, recalling combat flights where one wrong move meant annihilation. He did not need their belief, he needed precision, and he provided it without falter. He remembered the first time he had been forced to recite procedures under fire, the day a missile strike knocked out half his instruments and his squadron waited for leadership, how his voice over the comms had steadied them all. Tonight felt the same, except his squadron was a commercial airliner full of doubters, skeptics, and frightened families, and the mission was survival. The storm outside slammed with fury, lightning flashing so bright the cabin lit like day, thunder booming like artillery. But through it all, Marcus's voice guided them, steady, unflinching, unshakable. Marcus Daniels adjusted his posture in the captain's seat, his eyes flicking across every dial, gauge, and flashing warning light with the calm of someone who had lived his life surrounded by chaos. His mind organizing the storm of data into something manageable. The co-pilot, his hands trembling and sweat dripping from his brow, looked half ready to collapse under the crushing weight of responsibility. Marcus reached across and steadied the younger man with a tone that left no room for hesitation. Focus on fuel and pressurization. Monitor every 30 seconds and call out fluctuations immediately. I'll handle flight control. The young man nodded instinctively, the authority in Marcus's voice settling his nerves in a way no textbook or simulator had ever done. Outside, the storm battered the 777 with ferocity, rain pelting the fuselage like thousands of hammers, the wings flexing dangerously as turbulence shook the entire frame. Lightning illuminated the cockpit in violent flashes, revealing Marcus's face unshaken, his dark eyes narrowing in concentration, his steady hands guiding the yoke as if the massive aircraft were merely an extension of his own body. He rolled slightly left to counter a violent gust, his movements precise, deliberate, each correction pulling them back from the brink of disaster. He spoke again, sharper now. "Hydraulics reading?" The co-pilot snapped his eyes to the panel and replied, "Stable, slight fluctuation on System 2. Marcus nodded. "Keep it under watch. We lose hydraulics, we lose control. Keep me informed." Already the dynamic had shifted. The young co-pilot no longer paralyzed but functioning as a soldier under command, his role clear, his duty defined. Marcus knew that saving lives was never a solo act. Leadership meant drawing others into discipline, and discipline meant survival. In the cabin behind them, passengers clung to their seats, some still whispering doubts. But then the intercom crackled again, and Marcus's deep, calm voice filled the air. "This is Marcus Daniels, former Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force. I am assuming command of this aircraft until safe landing is achieved. Remain calm, remain seated, and obey all crew instructions. We will endure this storm together." His words rolled like thunder, but unlike the storm outside, his thunder steadied rather than frightened. People who had doubted him seconds earlier felt the involuntary chill of conviction, because it was not a plea, it was an order. And buried deep within humans is the instinct to follow a leader whose confidence does not waver. Mothers stopped crying and tightened their seatbelts. Fathers pressed children closer. And even those who muttered prejudice under their breath found themselves obeying without realizing. A flight attendant standing near Charles Wentworth whispered, "Did you hear that? That's not a man bluffing, that's a commander." But Charles, unwilling to surrender his arrogance, muttered back, "Anyone can sound commanding. It doesn't mean he knows what he's doing. We've put our lives in the hands of a stranger." His words fell hollow though, as more passengers began ignoring him, drawn instead to the strength that pulsed from the intercom. Marcus continued issuing precise instructions to the co-pilot. "Hold steady at 40,000 feet until we breach this storm band. Then descend by increments of 500 feet. Don't panic if readings fluctuate. Turbulence exaggerates. Trust the controls." The younger man responded crisply now, "Yes, Colonel," the title slipping out naturally, a subconscious acknowledgement of the authority standing beside him. Marcus gave a brief nod, not wasting time on satisfaction, only results. He guided the plane through a particularly brutal downdraft, the nose dropping violently, alarm screaming, but his hands firm, his voice calm. "Counter now, apply throttle, adjust pitch, stabilize good. That's it. Stay with me." The co-pilot followed, and the alarms quieted, the aircraft leveling after the terrifying plunge. Marcus leaned into the microphone again. "Ladies and gentlemen, turbulence will remain severe, but this aircraft is not failing. Keep seat belts secured. Trust the crew." The passengers braced as another violent shake rattled the plane, but many clung to his words like lifelines, because conviction in his tone was stronger than the chaos around them. In business class, Charles tried again to regain influence, standing and shouting, "You're all fools, he's not qualified. You'll regret trusting him." But his voice was drowned out by the roar of thunder and the memory of Marcus's commanding order. People turned away from him, some even glaring, no longer willing to lend their panic to his arrogance. A child whispered to his mother, "Mom, is he going to save us?" And the woman, though unsure herself, whispered back, "Yes, he will," because she needed to believe it, and so did everyone else. Marcus's hands never wavered, his voice steady as he coached the co-pilot through every fluctuation, his mind analyzing the storm's rhythm, finding patterns where others saw only chaos. He remembered combat missions where enemy fire and hostile weather combined, where failure meant more than death, it meant letting comrades down. Tonight was no different. These passengers were his squadron now, their survival his mission. Marcus Daniels had just finished steadying the plane through another violent burst of turbulence when a choked sound pulled his attention back to Captain Harris, slumped in the adjacent chair, the older man's body jerking suddenly. foam forming at the corners of his mouth, his chest convulsing as alarms from the biometric sensors screamed in warning. The young co-pilot froze in panic, his eyes darting between the instruments and the suffering man, his mouth stammering nonsense syllables, useless in the face of a medical crisis he had never been trained to handle. Marcus reacted without hesitation, his combat-honed instincts surging forward, because he had seen men convulsing under shrapnel shock, had dragged wounded comrades from burning cockpits, had treated soldiers with nothing but a field kit and his bare hands in conditions far worse than this. He unstrapped quickly, leaned over Harris, tilting his head to keep his airway clear, then barked to the co-pilot, "Check oxygen saturation. Now, give me the reading." The younger man fumbled, read off the plunging numbers, and Marcus cursed under his breath, then steadied himself, remembering the battlefield procedures etched into muscle memory. He pressed fingers against Harris's carotid, confirmed erratic pulse, then began measured compressions against his chest to stabilize rhythm while reaching for the emergency med kit stowed behind the seat. His motions were efficient, unhurried yet decisive, the co-pilot staring at him with awe. Realizing this was no improvisation, but the practiced skill of someone who had lived too long in the company of death and had learned how to claw men back from its grasp. Marcus administered a measured injection for the cardiac stimulator, then tilted the captain's head back, breathing into him, his voice low and steady. "Stay with us, Captain. Not tonight, not like this." The alarms gradually steadied, Harris's convulsions easing into weak tremors, his chest rising with shallow breaths. Marcus wiped foam from his mouth, adjusted the mask over his face, then strapped him more securely into the seat, his hand gripping the man's shoulder, silently willing him to survive. The co-pilot whispered hoarsely, "Where did you learn all that?" And Marcus, not looking up, replied, 10 years of combat rescues. 9 times I kept men alive who should not have seen another dawn. You learn fast when you're the only wall between a soldier and death." He returned to the controls smoothly, as though saving a man's life mid-flight was merely another part of the mission. In the cabin, however, the battle was of another kind. Charles Wentworth stood in the aisle of first class, his face red with fury and fear, using the chaos to amplify his own voice, his words dripping with contempt as he declared, "Do you all realize what's happening? That man in the cockpit is not who he says he is. He has no credentials, no proof, and we are letting him gamble with every one of our lives." He turned to a group of wealthy passengers seated nearby, their faces pale under the cabin lights, and added venomously, "Qualified people do not travel like that, dressed in common clothes, sitting in the back like a tourist. He is a fraud, and when we hit the ground, or if we don't, you'll wish you had listened to me." His wife, seated quietly beside him until now, whispered, "Charles, stop, this isn't helping." But he shook her off with a glare, raising his voice louder. "Helping? I'm trying to save us, unlike that imposter up front pretending to be a hero." Some nodded nervously, clinging to his confidence, but others shifted uncomfortably, remembering the steady command in Marcus's voice, remembering how it contrasted with Charles's hysteria. Marcus could not hear the tirade directly, but he sensed the weight of skepticism pressing against him like another storm front. He had felt it before, in hangars and briefings, the doubts whispered behind his back, the questions of legitimacy that shadowed every achievement. He pushed it aside now, focusing on stabilizing the massive aircraft, his hands confident on the yoke, his voice guiding the co-pilot through every procedure as though training him anew. The storm still battered them, lightning flashing, thunder booming, but the aircraft held steady, the balance of steel and willpower working in unison. Marcus reached again for the intercom, speaking in that same calm tone that carried authority without theatrics. "This is Daniels. Captain Harris has suffered a medical emergency. He is stable for the moment. I am assuming full operational command. Remain calm, follow crew instructions. We will see this through." His words spread through the cabin, steady and resolute, and passengers clung to them. Even those who doubted found themselves obeying. Charles sneered, his voice rising once more. "Do you not hear it? He's lying. He can't possibly treat a medical crisis and fly at the same time. This is suicide." But fewer listened now. the credibility of his arrogance eroding under the weight of Marcus's undeniable composure. Some passengers even told him to sit down, their patience fraying, their faith shifting to the unseen man in the cockpit. Marcus, meanwhile, adjusted the flight plan, guiding the aircraft into a marginally more stable current, his body operating as if storm and prejudice alike were adversaries he had fought 1,000 times. The co-pilot looked at him with awe, whispering, "You're more than a pilot, aren't you?" And Marcus finally turned his eyes to meet his voice low and certain, "I'm a survivor, son, and tonight, so are you." Marcus Daniels steadied the Boeing 777 once more after securing Captain Harris and guiding the co-pilot back into rhythm, his eyes locked on the wall of instruments that blinked with endless warnings, the storm outside no less savage, the roar of wind and thunder shaking the very frame of the jet. He exhaled and felt the old instincts rise, instincts born in combat zones where manuals became useless and survival depended on courage, calculation, and the will to defy what others deemed impossible. The co-pilot's voice cracked as he asked, "What's the plan, sir?" "The storm isn't breaking. Every approach vector is blocked." Marcus studied the radar, the green glow showing bands of violent weather closing around them like a cage, every safe path gone. He leaned forward, his mind working not as a passenger or commercial pilot, but as a warrior who had stared into worse. "We're not going around it," he said firmly. "We're going through it." Spiral descent, straight through the storm center. The co-pilot gasped, "That's suicide. No one's ever done that with a jet this size." Marcus's gaze never wavered. "Exactly. That's why it will work. Chaos leaves openings if you know how to see them. And I've seen worse." He adjusted controls, began scribbling quick calculations on the notepad, angles, rates of descent, tolerances of the aircraft structure, his mind recalling every piece of knowledge he had earned in sweat and blood. The memory flooded him as the jet shook violently. It was 2016, Iraq, a rescue mission gone to hell. 2 engines blown out by ground fire. The navigation system fried. Sandstorm swallowing everything. Visibility 0. His squadron scattered and screaming over the comms. Manuals had said eject. Command had said abort. But Marcus had known abort meant leaving 11 wounded soldiers to die in the desert. He had gripped the yoke of his crippled fighter, guided it blind through storm and fire, talking his men down one by one, refusing to surrender. He had brought them home when no one believed survival was possible, and that night earned him both scars and respect, though respect had been grudging, delayed, and sometimes denied because of the skin he wore. Now the same instinct surged through him, telling him that the spiral was the only way, the only chance to bring 278 lives safely to Earth. He turned to the co-pilot and said, "Monitor our descent speed and vertical load factor. Every second matters. Keep your eyes on fuel flow. Report the moment it destabilizes. I'll fly. You keep me fed with numbers." The young man nodded, swallowing his fear, because the calm in Marcus's voice made obedience feel natural, necessary. Marcus adjusted the intercom, speaking to the cabin, his voice steady, commanding, "This is Daniels. We are initiating a controlled spiral descent through the storm center. It will be violent, but it is calculated. Remain seated, belts tight, trust the process." His tone silenced the cabin, his words spreading through rows where panic had begun to claw again. Charles Wentworth, furious and desperate to regain control, shouted from first class, "Listen to him. He admits it's suicide, a maneuver never done in a plane like this. He's insane." But his words felt hollow now, his arrogance stripped bare by the steady presence that emanated from the cockpit. Some passengers turned away from him, muttering, "He doesn't sound insane. He sounds like a leader." Others nodded, clinging to the belief that this black man they had dismissed might be their salvation. Marcus gripped the yoke and guided the aircraft into the first banking turn, the 777 groaning as pressure mounted, alarms blaring, the wings flexing as if threatening to snap. He adjusted, kept descent at 3,600 feet per minute, his voice calm as he called out, "Counter the yaw. Reduce throttle by 5%. Hold the angle steady." The co-pilot obeyed, his voice crisp, "Yes, Colonel. the title flowing now without hesitation, instinctive acknowledgement of authority earned, not demanded. Lightning split the sky outside, thunder boomed, passengers screamed as the plane dropped, but Marcus remained unshaken, every correction measured, his eyes fixed on instruments, his muscles remembering the feel of turbulence. As an adversary, he knew how to fight. In his mind, Iraq echoed again, the terror of flying blind with death pressing in, the sound of wounded men groaning in the hold, the voice of command telling him to give up. But Marcus had never been one to give up. He had told his men then, "You'll live because I say so." Tonight, he told the storm the same. He leaned into the microphone, his voice deep, resonant. "This aircraft will live because I say so. I've flown through worse than this, and I brought every man home. I will bring you home too." The spiral intensified, pressure crushing, passengers pinned to seats, some sobbing, some praying, but many finding strength in his voice, that steady anchor in the chaos. Charles tried once more, shouting, "You'll kill us all," but his voice was drowned by the roar of engines and the growing sense that Marcus, not Charles, was the only thing standing between life and destruction. The co-pilot shouted readings. Marcus adjusted, his hands sure, his breathing steady, every fiber of him committed to proving once again that impossible was only a word spoken by those who had never faced it. The spiral descent continued as Marcus Daniels held the massive Boeing 777 steady through forces that threatened to tear it apart. His body aligned with the controls, as if he had been born in the seat, his mind processing turbulence, like an enemy's attack pattern. The co-pilot shouted readings at intervals, voice cracking, but obeying the colonel's every command, their coordination becoming tighter with each second, their teamwork transforming chaos into controlled risk. Yet Marcus knew instinct and discipline alone were not enough. They needed confirmation, authority that extended beyond the cabin. Because even if he succeeded in guiding them below the storm, they would need ground clearance, emergency support, and coordination on a scale larger than this cockpit. He reached for the radio, flicking to the military emergency channel, a channel he had not spoken into in years, but whose numbers were etched into his memory like scars. He pressed the transmit key and spoke with clarity. "Falcon to Pearl Air Force Base, civilian emergency, confirm response." His call sign rolled off his tongue with the weight of history, a name he had carried through missions where failure meant entire units perished. Silence followed for a moment, the storm roaring as if to drown him out, but then the response crackled in through the static, urgent and stunned. "Falcon, is that you? This is Pearl Command. Identity confirmation requested." Marcus leaned forward, steady. "Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Daniels, call sign Falcon, former 32nd Fighter Squadron, requesting immediate assistance. We are Flight 782, Boeing 777, 278 passengers on board. Captain incapacitated, co-pilot inexperienced, storm penetration underway, medical emergency in progress. I am assuming operational command." The voice on the other end returned faster this time, charged with energy, confirmed. "Falcon, you disappeared from radar 20 minutes ago. Entire Pacific Command has been scrambling. Pentagon has been notified. Stand by for priority instructions." The co-pilot stared at him, eyes wide, voice nearly breaking. "They know you, sir. They actually know you." Marcus nodded without looking away from the instruments. "They know me because I've done this before. Now, they'll help us finish it." The radio burst to life again, a new voice sharper, heavier with authority. "Falcon, this is General Hayes at Pacific Air Operations. We are monitoring your trajectory on military radar. Vice President has been briefed, National Security Council standing by. You have top priority. All commercial airspace is being cleared for your descent. Nearest viable landing site is Anderson Air Force Base, Guam, runway prepared, emergency medical teams on standby." The weight of those words filled the cockpit, the realization that the entire military machine of the United States was shifting to accommodate this one flight, that men and women in control centers thousands of miles away were watching every movement of Marcus's hands. In the cabin, passengers sat stunned as the intercom relayed part of the exchange, the confirmation of his call sign reverberating through the speakers. the authority of the military recognizing him instantly. Murmurs surged, disbelief turning to awe, fear transforming into fragile hope. A man whispered, "Did you hear that? The Air Force knows him." A woman clutched her child tighter, whispering, "They called him Falcon," like a code name. Even skeptics found themselves silenced because military confirmation was not theater. It was proof that the man in the cockpit was exactly who he claimed to be. Charles Wentworth's face drained of color as the realization spread. His earlier boasts of private jets sounding like pathetic echoes against the reality that the Pentagon itself was now watching the black man he had dismissed. He tried to shout again, "You can't trust this, it's a trick," but no one listened this time. Their eyes no longer turned toward him but fixed on the ceiling speakers as Marcus's voice returned with calm assurance. "Ladies and gentlemen, our trajectory is now being coordinated directly with the United States Air Force. Emergency crews are standing by. Remain calm, remain secured. We are not alone in this fight anymore." The storm battered them again, hail slamming against the fuselage like gunfire, turbulence rolling the jet like a toy, but Marcus guided it with deliberate adjustments, banking, countering, reducing stress angles exactly as his calculations demanded. The co-pilot reported readings, his confidence growing as he followed the colonel's precise rhythm, their teamwork strengthening as the storm howled. Marcus thought back to every time he had been doubted, every sneer and whisper that claimed a black man could not carry the weight of command. Tonight those whispers were silenced not by his words, but by the very institutions that once doubted him. Institutions now declaring him their anchor in crisis. The radio crackled again, General Hayes's voice cutting through. "Falcon, Pentagon requests confirmation of your plan. Spiral descent has never been attempted in a civilian aircraft of this size." Marcus answered without hesitation. "Plan is controlled spiral through central corridor of storm. Descent rate 3,600 feet per minute. Angle sustained at 14. Wing load monitored continuously. Calculations confirmed. It's the only viable solution." Silence followed. Then Hayes's voice, softer but filled with respect. "Understood, Falcon. Execute your plan. All eyes are on you." Marcus allowed himself the briefest exhale, then tightened his grip on the yoke, pushing forward into the descent with unwavering control. Marcus Daniels listened to the storm shriek against the fuselage as the Boeing 777 plunged in controlled descent, alarms flashing red across the panel, the co-pilot's voice shouting numbers in quick bursts. And yet within that chaos, his focus sharpened into pure steel. He knew the spiral descent was their only salvation, a maneuver never attempted by an aircraft of this weight and size. But his years in combat had taught him that extraordinary outcomes only emerged from extraordinary choices. 3,600 feet per minute, the co-pilot gasped, his voice trembling as the altimeter spun. Marcus nodded, his hand steady on the yoke. "Hold that descent rate. Monitor wing load. Report stress levels every 5 seconds. If the fuselage reads over limit, we correct immediately." The younger man obeyed without hesitation, his faith now tethered to the colonel's calm, each command carrying the weight of survival. Outside, lightning split the sky like white fire, illuminating walls of cloud that rose around them like cliffs of doom, the turbulence slamming the jet side to side, passengers screaming as oxygen masks swayed violently overhead. Marcus's muscles absorbed the violence, his corrections precise, his breathing even, his mind treating the storm like an adversary to outthink, not just endure. The radio burst alive again, General Hayes's voice pressing through static. "Falcon, Pentagon is monitoring. All civilian flights cleared. McCord Air Base confirmed as destination. Runway foamed. Emergency crews in position. Your priority is absolute." Marcus responded in clipped rhythm. "Copy. Descending through 30,000. Spiral trajectory. Holding. Expect ground in 12 minutes. Advise medical teams. Captain Harris unstable. Requires immediate cardiac attention." Hayes replied, "Understood. Falcon, proceed. Godspeed." The words carried weight, but Marcus shoved them aside, because Godspeed mattered less than discipline and calculation, the two allies that had kept him alive through war zones. He leaned into the spiral again, pulling the nose into sharper angle, the jet groaning as if protesting his demand. The co-pilot gasped, structural stress climbing. Marcus answered instantly. Adjust throttle down 2%. Redistribute with rudder. Hold her steady. The younger man obeyed, sweat dripping, but his hands no longer shaking. His fear reshaped into discipline under Marcus's command. In the cabin, the descent felt like the jaws of doom. Passengers clung to armrests, cries mixing with prayers, some sobbing, some silent in shock. Yet even within terror, there was a strange shift. People remembered Marcus's words, his promise, his authority, and though fear clawed at them, many found themselves whispering, "He will get us through." The transformation was visible even to flight attendants who had once doubted him, their eyes wide with awe as they steadied themselves against carts and walls, whispering, "He's really doing it." In first class, Charles Wentworth sat pale, his arrogance collapsed, his earlier tirades now echoing in his own ears like curses, the passengers around him ignoring him entirely, their faith ripped from his hands and placed into the one man who had earned it. Marcus kept guiding the descent, eyes flicking across instruments, adjusting for every gust, countering every roll. His voice instructed the co-pilot in constant rhythm, read me altitude, read me vertical load, read me stress factor. The answers came sharp, crisp, and he corrected with the instinct of a fighter pilot who once danced with storms smaller planes could not survive. He remembered the mission in Iraq, the crippled fighter, the storm of sand and fire, and the 11 men waiting on him to bring them home. Tonight was the same, except instead of 11 soldiers, it was 278 civilians who had once doubted him, people who had looked at him and seen ordinary, invisible, unworthy, but who would soon realize they had entrusted their lives to someone forged in impossibility. He adjusted controls again, feeling the jet's resistance like a living thing, whispering under his breath, "You will obey me. You will descend. You will live." The radio cracked again. "Falcon, McCord reports visual contact. Storm breaking south corridor. You are clear. Repeat, you are clear." Marcus's jaw tightened, his hands pulling the jet into final arc, the descent punching through the storm's belly, the clouds tearing open suddenly, revealing a glimpse of moonlight on rain-slick sky below. Gasps erupted in the cabin as passengers saw stars peeking through breaks in the storm, hope rising like breath after drowning. The 777 steadied as Marcus leveled the spiral into controlled glide, his voice strong over the intercom. "We are through the worst. Prepare for emergency landing." Cheers broke through sobs, relief mixing with exhaustion, some weeping openly, others clasping hands in gratitude, the fear easing for the first time since the nightmare began. Marcus guided the jet lower, his hands precise, his body aligned with the aircraft as if he were one with its steel. McCord Air Base runway appeared ahead, lights blazing against the darkness, fire trucks and ambulances lined on either side, crews waiting, ready. Marcus lowered the gear, his voice crisp, "Co-pilot, confirm flaps 20, confirm gear locked." The younger man replied with conviction, "Flaps 20 confirmed, gear locked." Marcus nodded, angling the nose for final approach, his mind calculating wind shear, descent angle, runway length, every detail. The storm still clawed at them, but its fury weakened, its strength no match for discipline and willpower. He called over the intercom, "Brace for landing. Stay calm. Stay secure." The Boeing roared toward the runway, wheels screeching as they met asphalt, sparks flashing under strain, the massive body jolting, then stabilizing under Marcus's steady hand. He guided it down the center line, braking with precision, rudder correcting, engines growling until finally the aircraft slowed, rolling to a stop surrounded by flashing emergency lights. For a long moment, silence reigned, as if no one could believe they were alive. Then the cabin erupted in cheers, sobs, applause, voices shouting gratitude. Flight attendants wept, hugging one another. Mothers kissed children. Strangers embraced. In first class, Charles Wentworth sat motionless, his arrogance stripped bare, his body trembling not from turbulence, but from the crushing weight of humiliation. Realizing every insult he had spat now hung around his neck like chains. The man he had mocked, the man he had dismissed as unworthy, had saved his life, had saved them all, while he had offered nothing but poison. The days after Flight 782's miraculous landing blurred into headlines, interviews, and investigations. But through it all, one truth could not be denied. Marcus Daniels, the black man passengers had doubted and dismissed, had saved 278 souls from one of the fiercest storms the Pacific had ever seen. News outlets replayed the Air Force transmissions where his old call sign Falcon had been recognized. Analysts described the spiral descent as a maneuver bordering on aviation insanity, and passengers who had survived wept on camera, declaring him a hero. The Pentagon convened hearings, not to question his decisions, but to learn from them. And within months, his technique was entered into NATO training manuals as the Daniels Spiral, an emergency procedure to be taught to future pilots worldwide. In Washington, a ceremony at the Pentagon promoted him to Major General, making him one of the youngest and highest-ranking black officers in modern history. Cameras flashed as he stood in full uniform, medals gleaming, his calm composure unchanged from the night he had taken command of a doomed flight. The Secretary of Defense declared, "General Daniels not only saved lives, but redefined leadership, proving to the world that character outweighs prejudice, and competence knows no color." Applause thundered in the hall. And for Marcus, it was not the applause that mattered, but the knowledge that his life's work had finally cut through the fog of doubt that had shadowed him for decades. He wrote a book titled Through the Tempest, detailing his life, his combat missions, and the night of Flight 782. It became a bestseller, studied not only in military academies, but in universities as a testament to resilience, discipline, and leadership under fire. He donated proceeds to scholarships for young aviators from underrepresented backgrounds, determined to ensure that future generations would not have to fight as hard for recognition as he once had. His speeches inspired thousands. His name became synonymous with courage, and his legacy grew larger than even the storm he had conquered. Meanwhile, Charles Wentworth's life unraveled in brutal irony. The very words he had spat in arrogance aboard Flight 782 had been recorded by passengers and leaked online. The video showing him dismissing Marcus with contempt and declaring he would rather trust himself. Within days, it went viral, shared millions of times, the public outrage scorching his reputation. Headlines labeled him the lawyer who mocked a hero. His law firm hemorrhaged clients, and within 3 months, he lost 90% of his business. Bankruptcy followed, the collapse swift and merciless. His wife filed for divorce, citing not only financial ruin, but years of arrogance and cruelty, taking custody of their children and leaving Charles to face the emptiness of his downfall. Reporters hounded him. His name became a cautionary tale, and even his children asked why people scorned him when they saw his name online. Years later, he worked at a used car dealership wearing a cheap blue uniform, taking public transit past the same billboard every morning. The billboard showed Marcus Daniels in full general's uniform, medals shining, standing with a stern yet compassionate gaze beneath the words, "Leadership has no color, only character." Each time Charles passed it, the humiliation burned anew, reminding him that he had once been on the same flight as greatness and had chosen to mock it instead of honor it. His life had shrunk to irrelevance, while the man he had tried to belittle had grown into a legend. One day at an airport, fate brought them face to face again. Marcus walked surrounded by aides and junior officers, his presence commanding even in silence. Charles, carrying a battered suitcase, hesitated before stepping forward, his voice trembling. "General Daniels, I want to apologize properly for what I said on that flight." Marcus studied him for a long moment, his gaze not cruel but piercing, then finally spoke with quiet gravity. "Mr. Wentworth, you gave me a gift that night." Charles blinked in confusion. "A gift? I mocked you. I tried to strip you of authority." Marcus nodded. "Exactly. You reminded me why I do what I do. Every mission, every soldier I saved, every barrier I broke came from proving men like you wrong. Your prejudice sharpened me, forced me to become undeniable. Without men like you, I might never have become what I am." Charles swallowed hard, shame flooding him, but Marcus turned and walked away, his words lingering like a verdict. The meaning was clear. True victory was not in humiliating an enemy, but in rising so far above him that his hatred became irrelevant. Marcus's life stood as proof that greatness does not need permission, that leadership is not inherited but earned, and that the measure of a man lies not in skin color or wealth, but in the courage to act when all others falter. For the passengers of Flight 782, for the military, for the world, Marcus Daniels became more than a pilot. He became a symbol that prejudice can delay recognition but cannot deny truth. And for Charles Wentworth, his downfall was not Marcus's revenge, but his own reflection, a mirror showing the emptiness of arrogance against the weight of real character. The end. If this story gripped you, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the plot struck you the most? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment and let's talk about it.